Welcome to episode 8 of Notes from the North. Today we had a guest, Sean Borman, who is an editor and writer over at Vikings Territory. So we'll throw it over to the interview now.
Welcome to Notes from the North with Kyle and Sam.
All right. Well, we'd like to welcome Sean to Notes from the North. Sean, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and what your background is in football, and then writing about the Vikings?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm originally from Prior Lake, Minnesota. It's a small town about 30 minutes south of Minneapolis. Grew up playing tackle football, played throughout high school, mainly running back, cornerback. I loved playing defense, loved hitting guys. It's my favorite part about football. I got my start, I went to college. I should probably start there. Studied sport management in Mankato. So to Minnesota State Mankato, same college as Adam Thielen. And there I studied sport management as well as economics, which is kind of where I got my interest in the salary cap. Not that I went to law school or anything, but that aspect really kind of just garnered my interest back in college. So I kind of fit in with the economics minor. But I started writing for Vikings Territory a couple years after college, 2017. I've had some really fun experiences with Vikings Territory, including being a credentialed member of training camp in 2018, which was one of the cooler experiences that I've had, especially, in the writing industry and the football industry, for that matter. I got to attend Kyle Rudolph camp as well for kids, which was a blast. I loved covering that. And Kyle Rudolph's actually a great interview. Very sincere, honest guy. So that was pretty cool to see him up and close in person. Got to do a couple events, hospital visit with Stefan Diggs with Vikings Territory. So it's been fun. It's been a fun ride. Lately, I've kind of focused more on the salary cap, which is, like I said, where my interest mainly lies. And so I'm really excited to kind of get going in that avenue of football.
Fair enough. Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to know was kind of when you got your start with Vikings Territory. And then, now I know your focus is kind of, you're right about different things. Obviously, I remember, you were just mentioning the Tampa Bay game, and I remember reading your piece about that. But obviously, the numbers, right? And so that makes sense. If you get the sports management, you get the economics. And then so that certainly makes some sense. And so do you then foresee, as you kind of keep chipping away at this, that you'll, I don't know if I want to say specialize, but you kind of focus in on this maybe more so as kind of your main thing that you hang your hat on? Is that what you foresee for yourself?
I do, in a way. You kind of search for a while for your identity as a writer. And that's tough on a lot of young writers, including myself. So once I found that, I really felt like I fit into the salary cap, and I've been lucky enough to reach out to guys, like Brad Spielberger with Pro Football Focus and Ken Ingalls with the Packers. He studies the Packers salary cap of all teams, but they've been really helpful as far as helping teach me salary cap stuff. And I've been actually looking at the CBA, which I never thought I'd actually read the CBA, but it's really interesting when you put it all together, and once things start making sense, it's actually pretty cool.
Cool. Okay. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Spielberger. We're going to ask you about, that interview, which is published over on Vikings Territory. So folks who are listening, who are interested in that, can definitely hop over to see Sean's article, but hopefully we can get a few of those insights in a moment. Sam, do you want anything before you hit us with second down?
Yeah, no, I was curious if one of the questions we were curious about is if you've always been a Vikings fan, and what your background with this team is, and how you've been tracking with them over the years, the good and the bad.
Yeah, I love that question. Thanks for asking that. Actually, I've 100% always been a Vikings fan. When I was young, I was actually interested in being a sports writer, and I got a chance to job shadow Steve Ashburner, who's actually a writer. I believe he's with Sports Illustrated now. He was a longtime Timberwolves writer. And so I got to go sit with him courtside at the game. And the reason I bring that up is you have to as a writer, as a sports writer, you have to be kind of even keeled and not one sided. And that's always been actually pretty tough for me because I've always been such a Homer Vikings fan. So that's another reason going into the salary cap is probably good for me. So I can focus on other teams as well and not just the Vikings. But 100% Vikings, I bleed purple. Hate the Packers, from a football sense. But yeah, definitely Minnesota through and through as far as football goes.
I know you and Kyle are just meeting, but do you hate the Saints as much as Kyle does too, or like where the Saints are in terms of ranking with the Vikings or with the Packers?
Not up to the Packers for me, but the whole cheating scandal. I mean, how can that not bug you just as a fan of football in general? That's
exactly.
So that definitely bugs me. They're one of my more hated teams, but yeah, not quite to the Packers standpoint.
This is good. Well, you're our first guest that's actually a Vikings fan through and through. So it's fun. It'll be fun for you and Cal to go back and forth and to see the differences and that. And so that's fun. But we do want to transition and talk about the cap, and yeah, like much has been made about the Vikings salary cap, and especially with the COVID cap and the curveball that's all been. Overall, like, how do you personally feel about how things look for Minnesota's finances?
Overall, I feel pretty solid. There's so much that's dependent, especially this year in kind of a down cap year, as well as the quarterback's, contract, his cap hit going up. So overall, I would just say in general, I feel pretty good about it. There's a lot of wiggle room that the Vikings have just in case they need it. They're probably not going to go out and make a big splash in free agency. You're not going to go out and get a J.J. Watt, for example, most likely. And some of those, even like the top 50, 100 free agents could be tough for the Vikings to afford. But on the flip side, I could see them making a couple mid-tier splashes. And we could talk about some specific guys in a little bit, but yeah, it's not the end of the world by any means. The cap could be better in order to bring in some better help around Kirk Cousins, as well as the defense, which is going to need help. But yeah, I could see them going into this offseason similar to last year, with 10, 15 million in cap room that they could spend in free agency. You obviously have to account for the draft class as well, but yeah, it's a lot depends on quite a few moves coming up here pretty shortly. So it's kind of an exciting time as far as the Vikings and the salary cap.
That's fair. And I'm like you. I think a lot of Vikings fans right now are a little bit doom and gloom when it comes to the finances. And a lot of times that gets put at Kirk Cousins' feet, which I don't think is, it isn't, he is well compensated. Like he does have a big contract, but I don't think that's necessarily all on him. Now, like yourself, I'm seeing some wiggle room. Again, I don't think they're going to go and get the big fish necessarily. It'd be shocking if, Chris Godwin comes to town or, something like that, or you mentioned J.J. Watt or whoever, some big time, really tier one player. But maybe before we even get to those free agents, if you put your general manager cap on, you look at this team, kind of some of those big ones, the Riley Reefs, perhaps the Kyle Rudolphs, et cetera, who stays, who goes, who gets restructured, kind of where do you think the Vikings kind of get creative with the money and free up a little bit of flexibility for themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I see it, I kind of try to take a look at the roster as a whole. I love roster building. I think it's good to take a step back every once in a while and just see what you've got. So, what in general do you think the Vikings would try to do this offseason? What would be like their plan is kind of how I think of it. And for like the 10th year in a row, you want to bolster the offensive line. You want to get better in the trenches, and unfortunately they don't have a whole lot of room to go out and get, a Joe Thuney or a Brandon Scherf. They could, but that's like all your budget basically. So it'll be a little tricky. As far as specific guys, I do see guys like Kyle Rudolph and Shamar Stephen as guys that could most likely be cut.
Yeah.
As far as Stefan, he's a little redundant with Michael Pierce. They're both run-stopping defensive tackles. And Rudolph, you've got Irv Smith coming up, and that's kind of whole nother story. I was a little upset to see the Vikings not utilize him better with Irv Smith Jr. Like Gronk, Aaron Hernandez is an example that keeps coming up for me. Those guys are both close to 1,000 yards receiving at one point for the Patriots, and with the Vikings, you get about 300 yards each out of Rudolph and Irv Smith, which is, I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but they could have been utilized better, in my opinion. So that's a reason why I think you're okay letting go of Rudolph, getting that cap back, start and featuring Irv Smith Jr., who looks to be a possible superstar in a couple of years in the NFL. So those are two guys I see probably being cut, maybe even before the league year on the 17th. And as far as guys you could extend to open up some cap space, I think Harrison Smith is a guy you could look at extending maybe to a 2-3 year deal.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to open up a lot of cap space just because he'll probably make close to what he's making now, 10, 11, 12 million a year. But you could probably get creative with the contract structure, backload it, and get some money right away. So get a couple million saved on the cap there. You mentioned Riley Reef. I think he's a good one as well. I think his cap hits about 15 this year. So you could extend him and get probably a similar deal, actually, to Harrison Smith, 2-3 year extension, backloaded, maybe even incentive-laden deal that you could, give to him, which would open up some cap space as well. So, the biggest questions for me on the offense would be Riley Reef, and on defense would be what they do with Danielle Hunter, which is I don't know what's going to happen there. We're kind of all in the dark, based on we haven't really heard anything besides that tweet from Ian Rappaport a while back,
right,
where his agent said he wanted to be the highest paid player, defensive player in the NFL. So it remains to be seen what will happen there. I know I talked to Brad Spielberger about that. There is a way that they could extend him and probably even lower his cap this year, which I hesitate to do because he's got 3 years left on his deal and he's got coming off a neck injury. But like Brad Spielberger said, it's a precedent thing, but at the same time, he's deserving of it. So I think looking at the cap, it would be a good way to kind of settle that whole thing for now. Just get it over with. You're paying Danielle Hunter big money, which he should be paid anyway. And then you don't have to worry about it for the next 5 years.
Right.
So I think that would be a good thing to do as well. I'm kind of running on here, but as far as restructures, I look at guys like Anthony Barr, Adam Thielen, and Eric Kendricks, who you could all restructure and open up. I think with Barr and Thielen, you can open up a little over $7 million apiece by restructuring those guys, which is considerable cap room.
Yep.
You're gonna have to pay for it down the road, but Kendricks, you'd open up about $5 million. So those are restructures that they could use if they need to. So there's quite a bit of wiggle room for the Vikings if they need it. And those are just some examples of what I would do personally.
Fair enough. And I think barring Kendricks, those are Zimmer guys. You know what I mean? Thielen, he is just a Minnesota Viking through and through. So to me, and these guys are still, I would certainly Kendricks is elite. Thielen is borderline elite. I would probably say Bard is really good, not quite elite, but these are guys who are in the prime of their career, excellent football players. It certainly makes sense to say, we're going to do some stuff, shuffle some money now, because we're reasonably confident that in 1, 2, 3 years, you're still going to be good players for us. Thielen's a touch older, so perhaps it's a little different for him, and maybe you don't want to go too crazy because he is, north of 30, but that certainly makes sense. But if we could return to Hunter, so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's 26. So he's mid-20s, in essence, the prime of his career. Now it's tough, and then he's coming off that big neck injury. And, as far as elite defensive ends, elite edge rushers, Hunter's towards the top of the list. And I think his number is relatively modest. I mean, it's just such a tricky situation. I mean, would you have, and it's impossible to know, but would you have any sense or any best guess in terms of what the Vikings will do here, or how they should proceed here, given that, there's still 3 years left. He's coming off the major injury, and yet he's in the prime of his career at an elite position. You know what I mean? And you saw what the defensive line looked like without him. So it's not like he's obviously extremely important for this roster. So is there some sort of middle ground, perhaps offering more guarantees, perhaps offering more incentives? What do you think is a reasonable move here in terms of trying to keep Hunter in Minnesota, but then still kind of navigating this very difficult cap situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I've talked to Brad Spielberger about, and I hate to steal his answer, but I think I'm going to, just because I think it's kind of the middle grounds that you were talking about. The way he described it is you extend him this offseason before the year, and you pay him, you drop his base salary all the way down to the minimum and give him a pretty big signing bonus, which is spread out throughout the length of the extension. I'd assume they probably do a 5-year extension. So you could, give a prorated cap at each of those years. And essentially, you don't make him the highest paid defensive player in the NFL, mainly because of the reasons that we talked about before. He's coming off a kind of a major injury, a neck injury, which is never really considered a light injury in the NFL. And he's under contract for 3 more years. It was him and his agent who agreed to sign the original deal. So it's not the Vikings' fault. They did, maybe it was considered a good faith move or good faith negotiating on their move to extend him that early. But looking back, they got a good deal. So long story short, I think they could still extend him, not make him the most expensive defensive player in the NFL, but come in maybe around 20, 22, 23 million a year. You're not going to be paid like 27 million a year just because of the reasons we talked about. And I think if you put in enough incentives in there, you could have him be okay with the contract, because him and his agent have to know that these facts as well too. So
certainly, yeah.
So
that's fair.
Yeah, that's what I would do. That way he's still a Minnesota Viking for 5 more years. He's paid in the upper echelon of NFL edge defenders, top 5. So I think that's a win-win for both sides.
Okay, fair enough. And if we were to flip over to, you already talked about him a little bit, Riley Reef. I mean, I think like a lot of Vikings fans, and I really don't feel comfortable about cutting him, because who are we to kind of get cute on the offensive line? If we have a solid player, who are we to say, get out of town, right? So I don't want. I think he's a good player. He's not a great elite tackle, but he's a solid player. And so the Vikings actually just gave him, they renegotiated to give him a $1 million bonus, that money that he missed out on because of missing week 17 due to COVID. The Vikings give him that $1 million. How do you interpret that? I mean, if their full intent was, I'm looking at that and saying, if their full intent was to cut him, well, they're not going to do this kind of good faith move and try and build goodwill. Does this $1 million bonus, do you understand this as foreshadowing, kind of a restructure, an extension, something to, hey, we want to work with you, we want to keep you because you're a solid part of our team and we value what you bring to our offensive line? How do you interpret that move?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. That's how I see it. The $1 million that they gave him, it should have been earned last year, a playing time incentive for starting all 16 games, or snap percentage, I forget which one. But either way, the $1 million will hit the cap this year. So 100%, I think it's a good faith move to say, like you said, we want to work with you this year. We value you and what you bring to the offensive line and the offensive line room. He's a great locker room presence from all accounts. He's a captain. and he leads by example. So I think he's a guy that you want to have around for at least a couple more years while you develop Brian O'Neill, Garrett Bradbury, and whoever you bring in guard this year. So I think he's definitely somebody that they want to keep around for a couple more years. As far as an extension goes, I haven't really thought too much about that. I think his cap hit will probably come down for sure this year if they do extend him from about 15 this year. But I could, from what I've heard, actually, they could be doing like a 2-3 year incentive laden deal where if he reaches all these playing time marks or what have you, he could earn more money based off those incentives. So maybe looking at like a cap around 8-9 million. He is getting a little bit older, but I think that's a pretty reasonable number. Maybe 10. I think 10 would be fair because, like you said, he's still a good tackle, and he could maybe get that on the open market. Maybe not this year, but yeah, somewhere. I think 10's probably you're looking at about the max, but somewhere 8, 9, 10 million, I think would be reasonable for him.
Sure, that's fair enough. And I think that number is a bit of a sweet spot, I think. So maybe I'm going to hit you with one question, not as rambly. In one sense, it's quite a simple, straightforward question, but it might be difficult to answer. And then I'll hand you off to Sam. Sure. But it's just simply this. Does Kirk Cousins justify the money? Does he justify his contract?
Yeah, I love that question. It's so interesting from so many different perspectives, from what you see with your eyes, from a salary cap perspective. You're going to get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask and how you ask and, kind of what perspective they see it. The way I see it from the salary cap perspective, he's not worth the money. And I don't mean that. I don't mean any disrespect at all. He's an asset in my eyes. He's a good quarterback, but he's not his role is not, I guess, worthy of the contract that he's receiving. Mm-hmm. And that's not really on him. That's kind of on the Vikings. He's kind of second fiddle to Delvin Cook right now on the offense. And for somebody that you feature, or somebody that you don't feature, I should say, it's hard to justify paying him $31 million this upcoming season and then $45 million next season. So I don't think he's ultimately worth it. He's a good quarterback, top 12 probably in the league, probably good enough to win a Super Bowl in my opinion. But he's got to have things perfect around him. So yeah, I guess that's how I'd answer that question.
Totally fair. I appreciate the nuance in the conversation that sometimes lacks nuance. Yeah, that's fair sure. enough. Sam, what do you got?
Well, yeah, no, I was just saying it's good to have someone that provides a different perspective, because I know I think that sometimes we've definitely taken the stance of advocating for Cousins, and I think that sometimes you do that, especially when you hear a lot of negativity. But I think that everything you say is definitely not. We definitely don't have a rebuttal to that. It all makes a lot of sense, and especially when you look ahead, that's a big number to swallow for a guy that, I feel like you could probably put him at the tail end of a top 10 quarterback, maybe falls into the early teens there in the NFL. But yeah, it is big money, and so glad to hear your perspective on that.
Kyle, can I ask you your thoughts on how you feel about that?
Yeah, certainly. So like the $45 million is extravagant. Now that to me is an extravagant number. And what's his name? Lombardi with The Athletic. He was a former NFL executive.
Michael Lombardi.
That's right. He made the point in one of his articles a while ago where he said a team doesn't get in trouble when a team pays elite money for an elite player. That's perfectly fine. A team doesn't get in trouble for that. A team gets in trouble when they pay elite money to a good player or a bad player. That's when there's the discrepancy between that salary and the on-field performance. So, I mean, am I upset if the Vikings were to pay Patrick Mahomes $45 million? No, I'm thrilled because he is the best. So to me, 31 this season, I think to me is a perfectly reasonable number within the context of the NFL. 45 million next year, to me, is not reasonable. And when I saw that extension, my first thought was that there's kind of maybe an unwritten expectation and belief that both sides will seek to rework this and restructure this before. Now, again, it's within a different context. The belief was that we would probably be around 210 million this year with the salary cap. And then in 2022, it'd probably be 215, 220. You know what I mean? Like it's that dollar is different in that context than in this context. But I have no issue at all with this year. Next year, I feel nervous. But my belief is that both sides will be interested in doing something. The only real question for me then is, will they play enough, or will they play well enough to still be around? Because I think Spielman and Zim are both in the hot seat. And if this team goes 7-9 again, I don't think they're coming back. And then now things get very interesting because Cousins is, he's their guy, right? Like they brought him in and they've kind of hitched their wagon to Cousins. And so it's just going to be I have no problem this year, but it's just going to be very fascinating after this year. And it'll be very fascinating if they don't play well, I think. Then now we have quite an interesting situation.
Yeah, agreed, 100%.
Yeah. A quick question then on that, because we're on it, and we might as well go with it then. Seeing what the trades have been like this summer for quarterbacks with Stafford and then Wentz, like, in your opinion, then is this potentially a time to move Cousins?
I'm so glad you asked that.
Because it feels a little bit like it's kind of like a now or like if you're stuck with him next offseason, like that's a whole lot different than moving him now.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm so glad you asked that, Sam. I think it's definitely worth monitoring right now because once you hit March 20th, that's 35 million guaranteed next year. So if you're going to trade him, it's got to be in the next month. So I think it's definitely worth worth monitoring, considering the deals that we've already seen go down with Goff, Stafford, now Wentz. So if you look at a team like the San Francisco 49ers, who, obviously that's been well talked about, the history with Shanahan. If they make the Vikings an offer that's too good to refuse, kind of like the Diggs deal last year, I think you can justify a trade of Kirk Cousins this offseason before that trigger deadline. So it's worth monitoring. Will it happen? I don't know. But as the old saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. So it could happen. I know all the experts are saying it probably won't happen, but that's kind of the safe answer. I don't want to say it will happen, but like I said, it's worth monitoring because this is the time to do it. Like you said, if they don't do it this season, Sam, they're going to have to work out an extension next year. And what if he has another kind of mediocre year this year? That's like, why are you sticking with him? So with the way his contract is structured, you can't release him after that $35 million trigger unless you want $45 million in dead cap. So definitely worth monitoring. I think if they could get multiple ones, it's a no-brainer. But if you could get a one and some change, it might be worth considering just because of the cap space you're going to free up not only this year, but in years down the road where you can really help a young quarterback if you were to draft one this year by putting pieces around him and really building up the roster around him.
Yeah. And I'm still figuring out the NFL cap a little bit, but I know that there is obviously dead money that would stay on. But say they were to move him, you're saying by that deadline in March, the only dead cap that would stay would be for this upcoming year, correct? Or would they have to worry about that contract in years falling?
So it would be a $20 million dead cap hit for this year, and then 10 for next year.
Okay.
Which is really not that bad in the grand scheme of things. The Eagles are paying Carson Wentz $34 million to play for the Colts this year, so that kind of puts things in perspective a little bit. So when you look at $30 million dead cap, it's obviously not great, but you I don't know, you really open things up in the future and open up a lot more possibilities as far as roster building goes.
Yeah, I wanted to pull up my calculator quick to figure out the percentage of the cap there, but that's like over 15% of your cap in a guy that's not playing for your team. That
Yeah.
hurts.
Yeah, definitely. I was surprised to see the Eagles do that, but it's the Eagles. They need some cap space, and man, they had a rough year.
Yeah,
which I really didn't mind.
Yeah. It is looking around at other teams. Like I think that from this conversation, you realize that while it doesn't look great financially, there's a lot of teams that are worse off, and that always is a comforting thing, I think, as a fan.
It is, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. We did want to ask you a little bit about free agent and free agent fits, and I know we've talked a little bit about it. Is there anyone you see that you're like, oh, that would be a really good option for the Vikings?
Yeah, there's a couple guys. It really depends on what position you're looking at, but the guys that stick out to me the most are actually guys that are on teams that are kind of projected to be released. So I'll start with those guys. I really like Kevin Zietler. Zietler. I actually don't know how you pronounce his name, but he's a right guard for the New York Giants. He's a former Wisconsin grad, so kind of a hometown area kid. And he's got a mean streak, which I love for any football player, but specifically guard, because the Vikings are really lacking that, especially in the pass blocking department. So I like Kevin Zietler. He could be somewhat affordable if he does hit free agency. On the flip side, on the defensive line, the same goes for Geno Atkins from Cincinnati. Still don't know if either of those guys are going to be free agents yet, but it's looking like they will be, and I think you could get them at quite a pretty big discount, considering what they made in years past. So, and considering the market, there's only a handful of teams that really have a ton of cap space. So I think the market for guys like that is going to be lower than it typically would. I'll put it that way. So I like those two guys as far as bulking up the offensive and defensive lines. There's some more value options, that might be a little more affordable. We just had Nick Easton released not too long ago from the Saints. I think he could be brought back for pretty cheap. I don't see a huge market for him. And also guys like, again, on the defensive line, switching again, I think Ndamukong Suh, don't know if he will be available. The Bucs might want to re-sign him, but he could be a pretty good option. He's getting up there in age. I think he's 34. But I saw his market value is only like $7 million. So that could be something that the Vikings could look at. As well as I saw you guys actually wrote an article on this guy, Shelby Harris. I think could be a pretty good value pick as well. He might have played well enough to make things close as far as the Vikings being able to afford him. But I see him being an option as well. One position that I think the Vikings could really benefit from that's not really talked about a whole lot is actually veteran cornerback.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of stealing Brad Spielberger's idea, but William Jackson III from Cincinnati is a guy that I really like. He's a little bit up there in age. He's 29, but he's going to be a free agent, barring a re-signing with Cincinnati. But yeah, I really like the veteran presence that he would bring, give the Vikings two solid outside corners in Dantzler and Jackson. You could push Mike Hughes to a different role, maybe, because you can't really count on him to produce this year, right, with the neck injury, so you don't know what you're going to get. And then Gladney is a full-time slot, which I think he would benefit from just playing one position. So that's, there's a few guys I like there. for me personally, I really like Atkins and Zietler.
That's fair. I mean, but I agree. I mean, Atkins would be a dream in my mind. I mean, I know he's a little bit older, but he'd just be an excellent fit. But I also like what you're saying in too with corner. I mean, the Vikings just kind of stubbornly refused to sign a veteran last offseason when it just seemed like so reasonable, when you had different options that could have been had for relatively modest deals, and they just instead opted to choose youth. And it makes some sense. Like, I don't think it was completely unreasonable, but it just didn't work out. So you bringing up corner there, I think, makes some sense. And I think with all the issues with both the lines, maybe corner has gotten overshadowed a little. And I see the value, certainly, in bringing in a steady vet who could frankly, just be a solid starter. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. But if I can hit you, so I'm going to ask you, I got 2 questions for you here. Rick Spielman calls you up. Somehow he tracks down Sean's phone number. Say, hey, Sean, this is Spielman. I'm super stressed out, dude. This whole stuff with the Vikings and the money, it's just crazy stressful. I only have enough money to sign an impact 3 technique, offensive guard, or returner in special teams. I can only sign one. There's just not enough money to sign all 3. Who am I going to sign, Sean? What am I doing here?
I like that question. I mean, you and me both being Vikings fans, die hard for a long time. It's been so frustrating to watch the guards.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. And I understand it to a certain extent. They're trying to go cheaper in that position, and maybe rightfully so. You don't want to really overpay a guard, but I think they've really, throughout the last couple of years, it's really proven to be a pretty important position if you're going to work the way the Vikings offense does. So I think I would go that route, just because you have a couple guys coming back on the defensive line that should help in Pierce and Hunter. 3 tech, you can maybe look to the draft to fill if you're just going to go with the one free agent. Mm-hmm. And special teams is just not as big of a factor as it has been in the past. As much as the Vikings need help there, I think you could really get the most out of your money, really, by picking up a guard and really protecting Kirk Cousins and helping Dalvin Cook in the run game. I think that's what I would go if I had to pick between the 3. You really just see what you have, will you just protect Kirk Cousins once and just see what can happen,
Yeah, that's certainly fair.
He could really even take his game to the next level. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, he's got elite offensive weapons. The skill players are excellent. And he has all kinds of ability, but that line in front of him is just so shaky, and particularly along the interior. So I think I'd probably choose the 3 tech, just because I played D-line. I love D-line. I started cheering for this team because of Kevin and Pat Williams. You know what I mean? So I think that's my own bias, but man, having elite offensive guard, Steve Hutchinson style, just like tremendous play would be, I'd just be so thrilled to see that. So I can certainly understand that perspective.
Yeah, that's definitely my choice number 2.
Yeah, fair enough. The one other question I have for you here then is, because a lot of our talk now has been external, right? And certainly the Vikings will be pursuing and flirting with and negotiating with external free agents and that kind of thing. But from within, our own team, who is a free agent or maybe even an RFA that the Vikings should prioritize bringing back? Or, would it be reasonable to bring them back? Because maybe it's not reasonable to bring Anthony Harris back. Perhaps it's too expensive. So who would you look at and say, yeah, this makes sense. This should be something the Vikings pursue?
Yeah, that's a pretty good. It's a good question, and it's pretty interesting answer if you ask me. Because when I look at the list of free agents, I'm doing that now. Your best free agents are Anthony Harris and Eric Wilson, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
They played, 95% of the snaps, if not more. The only other one being Dakota Dozier, who I don't think is a priority to bring back at all as a starter, maybe as a backup. But as far as Anthony Harris and Eric Wilson goes, I don't think you really need to bring either of them back, simply because I think they're going to be too expensive on the open market. Anthony Harris got the franchise tag last year, which may or may not have been a mistake in hindsight. Maybe not, because he played so well up to that. But he really had a down year last year. A lot of that was bad luck. A lot of that was a new role with the younger cornerbacks, and as we talked about, having absolutely no pass rush. So it's not entirely his fault, but I really think the safety position is not one that you need to pay a whole lot of money to in the Mike Zimmer defense. And it's tough because I looked at free agent safeties, and there's a lot of options, but there's not a whole lot of good ones. But I think you can get a whole lot of value from a cheaper safety who can make plays. Similar to what Anthony Harris did before the franchise tag year last year. So I think Harris, you could probably replace with a cheaper option and get a whole lot more value from a cheaper guy. Eric Wilson is almost a little redundant because you got Anthony Barr coming back, you got Kendricks, and those two linebackers are on the field almost 100% of the time. Whereas the third linebacker, they don't utilize that often. It's maybe 50% or so at the most that they're not in a nickel defense. I could be wrong there, but regardless, they're not playing 100% of the snaps. So I think a guy like a Todd Davis or even a Troy Dye, he was a rookie last year that was forced to play a little bit more than the coaches wanted him to. But I think they're going to be okay there. Just plugging into somebody, even a Cameron Smith coming back, hopefully. Hopefully he'll see some playing time. And so I think they're okay letting both of them go, because I think they're going to make some decent money on the open market. So getting back to your original question, I don't think there's anybody that they need to prioritize bringing back from the entire free agent list, which is rare for the Vikings to say. They're all good backups, the rest of them. But they could probably all be, honestly, you could probably bring every single one of them back on a minimum deal, which I think they could probably do and probably should do if they're able to.
Fair enough. Yeah, okay. Sam, what do you got for Sean before we send him off here?
Yeah, just wanted to wrap up, and I think kind of ask a question while also trying to figure out if I'm capturing all that you're thinking and saying. And I know we talked a little bit about J.J. Watt earlier, and obviously he would be a dream in many ways. Obviously, when you give a lot of money to someone and they don't pan out, then that would just be absolute disaster. But from your perspective, it seems like, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but that they're really hoping to sign several guys because they have several holes to fill at some good value contracts, and hoping that whether those guys play above what they're paying or maybe you have some guys internally that take that next step. That seems to be the ideal situation.
Yeah, that's more, I guess, my opinion. We saw what they did last year with Michael Pierce. They spent most of their budget on him, and that it wasn't their fault, but it just didn't work out because he opted out, which I don't blame him for at all. But I don't know if you guys follow Sam Ekstrom or not, but he's now with Purple Insider with Matthew Collar. But I really like his idea of finding multiple free agents at an affordable level who can fill those roles rather than going out and splurging on one guy. So I think that's the better way to go. That's better to spread out your money. It's kind of like draft picks. You don't want to like trade all your draft picks, into the first round for that one guy. You want to spread it out, take multiple shots at it in case somebody doesn't pan out, like you said. So, I mean, Watt would be super cool. He would fit perfectly, I think, as a 4-3 D end and rushing from the inside on third down. But I don't know how realistic that is. How cool would it be? But I think that as far as the philosophy goes, I think they're better off going that route. I know we talked about cornerback, going like a William Jackson. He's going to cost a lot. So I guess that's a little bit kind of splurging on one guy. But if you open up some cap room, I think you could really spread it around too and really bolster the lines where their focus should be. Because the alternative to not getting a guy like Jackson is paying a few corners like a Jason Verrett, I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Darquez Denard as another guy. You could go this route and pick up a couple guys on 1 year minimum or cheap deals, and that's another option as well. But I think spreading it out is probably the way to go. Long story short.
Yeah. Like if it's similar to what I've seen in other leagues, the big guys get paid the big money no matter what the circumstances are in terms of finances. But then some of those middle guys and those lower end guys sometimes get squeezed, and it feels like there's a better chance for some value there. Versus paying a guy big money. And I don't say that JJ Watt would be a flop. I just know there's been some injury concerns there, and I'm a huge JJ Watt fan, so that would be a lot of fun. It would bring a lot of energy, but it does feel like where the Vikings are at, and with the holes that saw this year, and just the way that hoping for the team to go, that your approach feels like the wise direction.
Yeah, it might not be the most fun or the most splashy, but it's probably the most prudent and most responsible way to go, I guess I would call it. So it's probably what I would do if I was running things, but luckily I'm not.
Yeah. Responsibility sometimes is boring, but it's
right.
it's wise. It's like you there's a reason why there's many of us that are fans and not management. Anyway, Sean, we want to thank you so much for coming on Notes from the North. So our listeners can find your writing on Vikings Territory, and you're also on Twitter at Sean Borman NFL. Anywhere else our listeners should know about, or anything else you want to plug?
No, that's pretty much about it. I'm working on some things for Vikings Territory, and you can find me on Twitter, like you said, at Sean Borman NFL. So I really appreciate you guys having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean.
Well, we'd like to thank Sean again for coming on. It was great to have another Vikings fan to bounce ideas off of, and I think he brought some different perspective than what we come with. So that was fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like Sam was saying, someone who covers the team and is passionate about the team, and kind of give some good nuance to some of the topics that we've talked about. That was great.
Yeah, it was great, and I think that I found the Kirk Cousins conversation particularly interesting, and I think that my perspective changes a little bit, especially when Sean started to talk about the salary cap implications and looking forward. I think it's easy to want to be all in on this year, and it's always important to focus on what's ahead of you, or in front of you right now. But I think it also is wise to be thinking about years down the road, because you don't want to be in trouble as a franchise later on.
Totally fair. I mean, it's got to be, and that's management. I mean, the coaches need to be all in on right now, but the upper management, the front office needs to have, kind of a foot in both worlds, where we're prioritizing the right now, but we're also cognizant of what's coming down the pipe after 2021. And so certainly, and then that's when you're talking about salary cap stuff, right? And the finances. And so certainly it makes sense that, this season is a priority, but so too are the other ones as well. So
yeah, good. Well, moving into our odds and ends here, we want to talk about the Minnesota Wild. And last time we talked, they were postponed due to COVID issues, and they hadn't played since February 2nd. They got back exactly 2 weeks later, playing their first game on Tuesday against the Kings, getting I don't want to say shellacked, but they lost pretty bad 4-0, and unsurprisingly, they look like a team that hadn't played for 2 weeks. But they've followed up with 2 good wins against Anaheim, and right now they're sitting 6th. But again, if you look at points percentage, things change. They would actually move into that 4th spot. So things are looking up. They did miss some games against some of the top teams in the division, and so it'll be interesting to see what that looks like moving forward. But regardless, they're still there. The one thing I did want to talk about, and it actually relates well since we're talking more about the Wild, talking about football and actually talking about JJ Watt. Watt had a tweet, I don't know, Kyle, if you saw it, but he said something along the lines of this free agency stuff is wild. And the Minnesota Wild actually retweeted that and had photoshopped him in a jersey of the Minnesota Wild. So he's got pitches now from multiple leagues to come in. And JJ Watt actually has a little bit of skill. There's some videos of him on the internet playing hockey. But my question that I wanted to ask Kyle with no prep was if you could think of a player, preferably on the Vikings, that you could see being a crossover athlete, particularly hockey, but maybe if it's not hockey, maybe it's something else. But if there's one guy that you're like, man, it'd be fun to watch him play a different sport.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, JJ Watt's such a gifted athlete, so he could probably just do anything he wanted. To my mind goes to Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook, the guys with great feet who are super quick, super balanced, and could, those are just, transferable athletic attributes, right? Just explosion, balance, being able to get in and out of cuts. That's going to serve you well in basketball, in hockey, in tennis, in all kinds of different sports. And so that, to me, I would maybe pick one of those offensive skill guys, maybe a Thielen or a Jefferson, as someone who could make that switch relatively easily, not easily, but relatively easily, just because they're so gifted athletically. That to me makes some sense.
Yeah, no, I feel like that's definitely a thing, and obviously the hockey's a little bit different. Than football and the skating. They say like it's a whole different thing, and so I'm not obviously saying that they're going to jump right in, but I thought of Jefferson when I was thinking about the question, so that's neat. Anyways, well, let's hear some words of wisdom.
Yeah, the words of wisdom this week. I was thinking of what to say, and I was looking at Hebrews 11 actually, which is kind of a famous chapter in the New Testament. It's kind of colloquially known as the Hall of Faith because you have the author of Hebrews referencing all these great figures within our faith tradition and kind of briefly recounting what they did and how they proceeded by faith. And Abraham and Moses and, et cetera down the line. He's basically, since you have such a great crowd of witnesses, therefore proceed in this manner, therefore conduct yourselves in this manner. This is the tradition that you find yourself in, therefore. And so the Vikings are a team that has, we've never gotten that championship, but we have this tremendous history of elite talent, some elite teams, some great players. So let's cast off some of those things that are hindering us and holding us back. Look to this really what is a rich history and a rich tradition, and proceed to the finish line and try and get this thing done this year. That's my pitch here.
Yeah, that's great. It's great. Well, we want to thank everyone for listening, and also just want to just really extend a sincere thanks for people that have been listening up to this point. It's been a lot of fun to do this, and we've been figuring stuff out, and I know I'm figuring out stuff with sound and got a mic now, and we're really having a lot of fun, and would love to hear from people if they have any thoughts, any suggestions, good critical feedback. Nothing too critical. We are sensitive But we would love to hear from people and hear even what people are enjoying. You can always reach out to Kyle on Twitter, and we just want to continue getting better. But yeah, thanks for listening to this episode, and just want to thank Sean again. Be sure to stop by VikingsGazette.com for great Minnesota Vikings news, commentary, and analysis. And the Vikings Gazette can be found on Twitter and Facebook now at Vikings Gazette. And I personally can be found on Twitter at SamAllison98. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk with you in a couple weeks.